Hi, my name is Guy Davidson, and today I'm going to talk to you about some work with Brendan Lake on examining infant relation categorization for deep neural networks. To start, if I were to show you this stimulus, and then ask you which of these two stimuli is more similar to the familiarization stimulus in the middle, you'd probably agree that it's the one on the left. And why is that? Because it depicts this target object in the same relation to this reference object that is below, rather than this one, which depicts it above. Similarly, if I were to show you this familiarization stimulus and then this pair of stimuli, you'd again probably pick the one on the left, depicting the target object between the bars rather than the one depicting the target object outside the bars. We model some developmental findings from Paul Quinn and colleagues, and the first set of findings is that categorizing these above versus below relations, that is, a familiarization stimuli as being above or below a single reference object, is easier than between versus outside. And by easier, we mean that infants tend to acquire this earlier in development, 3 to 4 months here versus 6 to 7 months here. In another set of studies, Quinn and colleagues looked at acquiring relations for the same target, here the target is a triangle both in the familiarization and in the probe stimuli, or for different targets, here this E and this plus. And they found that again, infants tend to acquire relations for the same target a few months before they can categorize relations for different targets. Very little computational work examined this sort of infant spatial relation, and we're trying to understand why are some categories acquired before others in development. The mechanisms we're going to apply are neural networks, and in particular there's been a recent focus on relational learning and machine learning. Some of it has been on architectures for relational learning, such as the RelationNet by Santoro and colleagues in 2017. Other work has been on applications in physical inference. Hamrick and colleague introduced this gluing task, asking where you might have to glue these blocks in order to stabilize the structure. Kipf and colleagues looked at inferring the relations between objects from observed dynamics. And we're wondering, could we apply these advances to model infant relation learning? And in particular, when infants discriminate between categories in a lab experiment, is it bottom-up processing of categories that they've developed during the familiarization, but using high-level visual features acquired outside the lab? Or is it top-down processing of categories they've already acquired outside the lab? There's been substantial prior work on this topic, going back to Phelan and Smith in 1994, and previous computational work, such as work by Marshall and colleagues and French et al., used small connectionist networks. And we're going to use deep neural networks to explore both of these types of processing. The bottom line is that we can account for these main developmental findings, but that the modeling choices we make have substantial impacts on our results. In our first experiment, we'll look at categorizing relations with no prior knowledge. So we're going to model the first set of developmental phenomena, that is that learning this above versus below relation is easier than learning this between versus outside relation. We are going to train small neural networks, several thousand parameters only, on direct object representations that we tailor to map stimuli to relation labels, essentially treating each of these as a binary classification problem. Does the stimulus depict above or below, and does the stimulus depict between or outside? We think about this as a proxy for acquiring category representations before the lab experiment, and then simply applying these categories in the lab. So how hard is it to acquire these categories when you're learning them directly? We use sort of minimal viable object representations. So here if we have this target object at position 9, 8, and this reference object ranging from 6 to 14 by 12 height, and the target will be represented by a vector with 9 for x, 8 for y, and 1 hot depicting it's a target. The reference object will be represented by a series of objects that we treat it as unit objects attached to each other. So any ranging from 6 to 14 in the x, and all in 12 on the y, and all marked as being a reference object. So to create the stimuli, we sample a location for the reference object, and we place a target object in the vicinity. And here are a couple of examples for above and below, while here are some other examples for between and outside. We're going to split the locations of the target and reference objects between train, validation, and test sets. And we're going to evaluate models creating on the full test training set we create, that is about 3,600 items, and on smaller random subsets. We evaluate 5 different architectures that we chose to be reasonably invariant to the number of objects. The first one is a simple multilayer perceptron. So if we take the stimulus and extract out these vector representations as we did before, first we apply a single object-wise function acting on each object independently. That's a multilayer perceptron. We combine these representations by averaging them, and then pass this average representation into another MLP and ask it to produce a probability for above and a probability for below. A second architecture we look at is a relation net from Santoro and colleagues. Here, we again pass the input vectors and create these embeddings, and then we take each pair of embedding and pass it through a pairwise MLP. So now for each pair we have a new representation. We again combine these pairwise representations by averaging them, and then pass that into an MLP and again predict above or below. We also look at a convolutional neural network, a transformer-like architecture, and a predates, a neural network designed for relational reasoning from Shanahan and colleagues in 2019. And we configure all of these models to similar sizes, so the parameter counts don't affect the results too much. Let's start with some results. Here we look at the sample complexity. So on the x-axis we plot the training set size in log scale, anywhere from 8 objects to the full training set of about 3,600 items. On the y-axis we plot the accuracy on the held out test set. We see that the multilayer perceptron sort of struggles up until it reaches at least 512 items, and from that point on it does fairly well on above versus below, but it has a very hard time acquiring the between relation above chance up until it receives the full training set. The convolutional neural network does much better, performing markedly better than chance with as few as 8 training items and performing rather well anywhere further, but still has a harder time when between, so only reaching high accuracy with the full training set. The relation net performs better than the multilayer perceptron on above versus below, but quite struggles with between, and we'll talk more about this in a moment. And the transformer and predates managed to perform right around where the convolutional neural network was for the transformer, with the predates doing even better. And in fact, the only model reaching perfect performance on between before just about the full training set. For another measure, we look at how many passes through the data does the model require in order to be successful, and we find very similar results. When above versus below, we find that the MLP takes the longest to reach plateau accuracy, then the relation net, and that's the predates, the transformer, and the convolutional neural network all work somewhat quickly, and this is with a data set of 1024 items. And the between relation, the relation net, and the MLP barely get off the ground. The transformer and convolutional neural network take a while to plateau and plateau to reasonable accuracies, while the predates plateaus basically perfect accuracy very quickly. What did we learn from this experiment? We learned that learning to categorize above versus below was indeed easier than between versus outside, matching the developmental phenomena we sought to model. We found that the predates, the transformer, and the convnet all recovered the qualitative patterns, while the relationate didn't, and we think it might be because the pairwise function over objects is harder to scale once you reach the multitude of objects required for between. The multilayer perceptron might also be overly generic for this problem, as it also struggles to acquire the between relation. In our second experiment, we look at categorizing relations with pre-trained vision networks. So here, in addition to the phenomena we modeled before, that categorizing this between versus outside relation is harder than categorizing this above versus below relation, let's look at the other set of phenomena. That is, that categorizing relations for an identical target is easier than categorizing relations for varying objects. We're going to use pre-trained vision models with these sort of synthesized stimuli that we've been showing. We treat it as a representational similarity problem. That is the representation for the familiarization stimulus more similar to the representation of the probe stimulus with the same relation rather than to the probe stimulus with the other relation? And we think about this as a proxy for using sort of like high-level visual features that an infant might acquire outside the lab to quickly construct a representation for the category during the lab experiment. We also looked at 2 alternative stimulus renderings to make sure that our results are not dependent too strongly on how we render our stimuli. One is using geometric shapes, so there is a solid bar instead of the dashed bar we had before, and it's a few different types of targets, so there's a circle and here is a triangle. And in another one, we took these shapes and added colors to them to make sure that that isn't particularly impactful. So we randomly sample colors for the reference objects and the target objects. The architecture we're going to look at is MobileNet v2, and in the paper we also examined the ResNext architecture. We look at two different pre-training methods. One is supervised pre-training on ImageNet, a standard dataset and computer vision staple. And the other is self-supervised pre-training on SACAM, which is a dataset collected from headcams attached to free delightful babies, and this is what it looks like. And we're going to use SACAM in a self-supervised temporal classification fashion following the work of Orhan and colleagues in 2020. We use the cosine similarity as our representational similarity measure, and again asking, are the representations for the two stimuli depicting the same relation more similar than for the two representations depicting the different relations? And we have several conditions, above versus below or between versus outside, using the same target in the probe or a different target, and rendering vertically or rendering horizontally, that is left versus right instead of above versus below, and a horizontal between or outside versus the regular between outside. Let's look at some results. The first thing we find is that if we compare same versus different target, we look at the adjacent bars here, find that the accuracy with the same target is consistently higher than the accuracy for a different target. This is for both of the pre-training methods we look at and for both of the relations we look at. And that is promising. That recovers one of the developmental phenomena we sought to model. Now, if we compare the different pre-training methods, we find that the egocentric, from a baby's perspective, SACAM outperforms the pre-training on ImageNet rather consistently. So now compare the same color bars in the different groups, and we find that this, in fact, replicates with the between relation as well. We can also compare the different relations. So if we look at each bar and the corresponding bar in the other plot, we find that, indeed, fairly consistently, the accuracy in the above versus below condition is higher than the accuracy in the between condition. And in case it's a little hard to see, these are the exact accuracy differences we find. However, when we go to the left versus right results, we found completely different findings. So the accuracy is much lower. In fact, the accuracy on SACAM is barely above chance for left and right and is below chance for ImageNet. We don't find any consistency between same and different targets. In fact, ImageNet does slightly better on different targets on the left and right result. The vertical between performs very similarly. That is, we find, in fact, higher accuracy for different targets in both of these cases. And we also find that the accuracy in the vertical between condition is higher than the accuracy in the left-right condition consistently, which we found a little baffling, but we have a potential explanation for. So what can we learn from this experiment? We did indeed recover that above, below, and between outside show both of the developmental findings we modeled. Above versus below was easier than between versus outside, and the same target was easier than varying targets. We did find this discrepancy with the left-right and, with the vertical between condition, failing to recover, a discrepancy from work from Quinn and colleague that replicated the results for the regular above and below and between outside in 1999 and 2004. And we think this might be an artifact of the way we do data augmentation. So the standard suite of data augmentation includes horizontal flipping, but not vertical. So if we treat images where the horizontal axis is flipped as identical, we're going to have a very hard time distinguishing left versus right. And so that's a thing we would like to look at in the future. And we find that SACAM performs ImageNet, which on one hand has a very nice story on this naturalistic, egocentric, from the baby's perspective data set doing better, but it could also be the self-supervised training procedure. To conclude, we found that various neural network architectures and approaches are consistent with the developmental findings we looked at, and that makes us reasonably confident that neural network models can be used to study acquisition of relation knowledge, both before or during lab experiments. We are worried about this discrepancy between the horizontal and vertical findings in experiment 2, and we're going to look at a closer investigation of the effects of both pre-training procedures and data augmentation. And we also hope to look at modeling additional developmental phenomena using a similar neural network-based approach. and look at using other self-supervised procedures such as on ImageNet to determine if it's the data or the pre-training procedure that accounts for the discrepancy we see. And finally, we're curious to see if models that better account for visual stream activity will also recover developmental phenomena better. Thank you very much.